My name is Bobby L. Lovett, PhD, Professor of History, parentheses, retired, Tennessee State University. Before the Civil War, black educational opportunities for Negroes was almost non-existent. Free Negroes in Nashville did operate some classes in schools clandestinely between 1833 and 1857 until they were shut down by vigilantes in January of 1857 because of recent race riots in the city of Nashville. 90% of the slaves, therefore, were illiterate. Perhaps 10% of them could read and write a little bit, whereas masters often had to teach them some degree of literacy in those skilled trades because about 10% of the slaves were urban, and they ran errands for their masters. They worked in their shops, in their offices, and so on. So about 10% of the slaves, we estimate, could read and write a little bit. But illiteracy was not unusual in Tennessee in antebellum times. More than half of the people in the state couldn't read and write. Therefore, it was forbidden for slaves to learn to read and write in that day and time. However, at least two institutions in the state of Tennessee in higher education included some black students. Maryville College, as early as the 1830s, and Franklin College outside of Nashville by 1855 to 1860 allowed a few free Negroes to attend classes there. It was mostly a manual labor college, however, so it was not a liberal arts-based college like Maryville. And it was also religious instruction, just like Maryville College had mostly religious instruction. So there was very little elementary, secondary, high school, or college education available to African Americans before the Civil War. However, African Americans comprised 26% of Tennesseans by 1860. And so 1/4 of the population education was almost forbidden to them until the Civil War. The coming of the Civil War really was the opening chapter of black education in Tennessee. As soon as the Union occupation began in Nashville in 1862, free Negroes reopened those schools that had been closed in 1857. Small classes, 30, 40, 50 students. And one of the teachers of the first of those schools to be opened was a man by the name of Daniel Watkins, spelled with a D, W-A-D-K-I-N-S. And Watkins had been one of those teachers that ran the antebellum free Negro classes clandestinely back in the 1850s. And when the Union came to town, the Union Army, they were able to restart some of those particular classes. They were private. You had to pay a few cents to go to those particular schools. But in 1863-64, Northern missionaries began to come down into the occupied parts of the South. And the first things they did were to establish schools for these freedmen who were now living in camps, contraband camps, for example, over in East Nashville, which was called Edgefield, out in South Nashville called Edge Hill Contraband Camp, and a big contraband camp out in the western section of Nashville, where incidentally Fisk Free School began in 1865 in that contraband camp. And so by 1864-65, with the establishment of contraband camps across Tennessee, Northern missionaries are now coming with clothing, they're coming with food, medicine, they're coming, of course, with Bibles, but they're also coming with books to teach the slaves, adult and children, how to do their alphabets, how to read and write. And so the period between 1862 to 1865 during the Civil War is the beginning of the spread of education to all black Tennesseans at that time. A contraband camp was a place that consisted of tents and log cabins, temporary structures, where slaves who had ran away from the farms and the plantations into the Union camps were housed, because by 1862, so many slaves were escaping the plantations and the farms in the center of the battlefields, Virginia and Tennessee especially, that the Union had to pass an act called the Confiscation Act in 1861 that justified the Union Army keeping those runaway slaves instead of returning them to their owners as the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law provided. The Union is now saying these are weapons of war. Anything that is contraband, like today, the war on drugs, they can confiscate the drugs, they can confiscate the cars bought with the drugs, they can confiscate the houses today, and in the Civil War, they could confiscate anything that was used to make war against the United States. And so they declared fugitive slaves contraband if their masters were in rebellion against the United States. So they asked the runaway slaves, "Is your master fighting against us?" And the slave, of course, said, "Yes, he's fighting against you, and he's in the Confederate Army." And that was all that was needed for them to stay within the Union camp. And so many thousands came that in August 1862, in Grand Junction, Tennessee, the general in charge, Ulysses S. Grant, asked one of the chaplains to begin to establish a place to keep these people, because winter was coming, fall was coming, winter was coming. They had no clothing on, they had no shoes, they had no houses to live in, they had no food. These were women and children and babies and men as well. And so they started the contraband camps in the fall of 1862. They spread across Tennessee, they spread across the Mississippi Valley. Anywhere that the Union Army was in occupation, they had to establish these camps in order to house all of these runaway people. The Civil War, as far as African Americans are concerned, closed with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, December 18th, 1865, which prohibits slavery now throughout the United States. African Americans are free everywhere in the United States as of December 18th, 1865. At the same time in Tennessee, that 26% of blacks, of Tennesseans, blacks, they have been freed by the state of Tennessee. On February 22nd, 1865, the Tennessee Constitutional Convention recommends that slavery be abolished in Tennessee. Secondly, that Constitutional Convention recommends the repeal of the 1835 Constitution section that protected slavery. And thirdly, it recommended that the Ordinance of Secession, which had been passed by the Tennessee General Assembly in June 1861, be repealed. In March 5th, 1865, the people go to the polls and they vote, all men at that time. They vote on those proposed changes and they approve all of them. And consequently, on the 5th of March, slavery is officially ended in the state of Tennessee. On April 5th, a month later, they inaugurate the first civilian governor since 1861, and that is the man from East Tennessee, Parson Warren G. Brownlow, becomes governor. And they and the legislature of Tennessee, the General Assembly, they approve on that day the ratification by Tennessee of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which will eradicate slavery throughout the country. Tennessee is one of the first states to ratify that amendment. You're going to need 23 states to ratify it in 1865, and that number of states ratifies the amendment on December 18th, 1865. Eventually, all the other 33 states ratify, except 3 or 4. Kentucky didn't ratify until 1891. Kentucky was a tough state, a whole nother story as far as slavery and Civil War secession was concerned, a whole nother complex story. But they do eventually ratify it. Tennessee is one of the first. The last state to ratify was the state of Mississippi. And the state of Mississippi did not ratify the amendment that freed the slaves until January 2013. Just recently, that Mississippi finally ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. That's been a national story, because everybody thought that everybody agreed that slavery was over in the United States. There's one state that did not agree. And that state finally, with the help of the Black Legislative Caucus in Mississippi, passed ratification in 1996. But until 2013, it was not sent to Congress. You have to send the amendment to the 2 houses, you send the amendment to the Secretary of State, and you send the amendment to the U.S. Register, who records it and so on. And Mississippi said the Secretary of State of Mississippi overlooked that in 1996, and somebody reminded them, a college professor at Southern Mississippi University, that it was not in the U.S. Register. And then they looked and found, sure enough, the man didn't send it in. And as a result, technically, Mississippi did not ratify until January 2013. Well, Jim Crow laws, as one historian, C. Van Woodard, points out, had their origins in antebellum times. There were no Pacific laws before the Civil War that said blacks could not go eat here, or they couldn't stay in this hotel or lunchroom or so on. But there were what we call black codes before the Civil War. For example, in Nashville, German immigrants had the city council to pass a city code that said free Negroes and slaves could not engage in the butchering business. That was dominated by German immigrants. Nashville was a big slaughterhouse and processed meat here until recent times off of the river. It was other laws that said a Negro, free or slave, could not own a freight wagon. Free Negroes could own hacks, which today we call taxi cabs, but they couldn't engage the wealthy trade of heavy freight on the river, on the wagons, and so European immigrants had those kind of laws pushed through. There were curfews for blacks during antebellum times in Tennessee, but none for whites. So laws that discriminated between the races we call Jim Crow laws. And there were Jim Crow laws, according to the way you look at it, before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, the whites have to decide, what do we do with 26% of the population, most of them former slaves? They're all of African descent. Do we integrate them into the society like when the Germans arrived in the 30s and the 40s, 1830s and 40s, when the Jews arrived in the 1790s in Tennessee, when the Irish began to come in droves to Tennessee, especially Memphis, in the 1850s? Do we just assimilate them into the society, or do we have to do something different? Luckily, they decided that they would not do to the Negro what they had done to the Native American. 1830, President Jackson and the Congress had removed these people from Tennessee, removed them from Georgia, from Alabama, from Florida, from Louisiana, from Mississippi, the Choctaw, and made them march all the way out to a reservation in what today is Oklahoma. So Native Americans had been not only not segregated from the rest of society, they had been excluded from the rest of society. And there were proposals during the Civil War, including coming through President Lincoln's office, to colonize the freed slaves somewhere else: Central America, West Indies, Latin America, Mexico, outside of the United States. But the final decision is made to free the slaves in the United States, December 18, 1865. But now what do? He's a freedman, he has no rights, can't vote, can't sue, he owns no land. What do you do with him? And so in 1866, Congress proposes a new amendment, and that is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Finally ratified, took 2 years to get agreement in 1868. And that provided that anybody born in the United States is hereby a citizen of the United States. Didn't use race, but they're talking about the former slaves. All that 4.5 million people are now citizens of the United States, just like that, with one sentence. All persons born in the United States are hereby citizens of the United States. And they are to be given equal protection of the laws. Third part of the amendment, due process of the law. You can't do anything to him unless you put him in jail or whatever, unless you do it according to the due process of law, says that particular amendment. And so by 1868, he is a citizen. And Tennessee has already agreed to this in 1866. He's now not just freed, he's a citizen of the state of Tennessee by 1866. But now legislators are debating how do we treat him? The 14th Amendment says you got to treat him equal. But they develop separate but equal. They develop laws in the General Assembly of Tennessee that are Jim Crow laws. The first one says a person of African descent, and I'm paraphrasing, a person of African descent, even a mixed race, because 10% of the slaves are mulatto. Half of the free Negroes are mulatto. Mulatto means one of the parents is white and one of the parents is black. They are of mixed parentage. Even those persons cannot marry a white person, as they described it in that 1866 legislation. They also develop laws about whether they can vote or not. And so, and Nashville and cities that have horse-driven, drawn streetcars, they provide that they must ride on the back of the streetcar, which are driven, drawn by horses. So the first Jim Crow laws are really passed as a reaction to the emancipation of these 4.5 million people that are living, 90% of them, in the 15 southern former slave states and former Confederate states. And this is a way to govern the races, as people argue at that time. In 1870, the Congress decides to deal with another problem. They propose the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, that all persons who are citizens of the United States are guaranteed the right to vote, so the vote is protected. And they are not mentioning race, color in any of these national amendments, just as the founding fathers wisely and cleverly did not mention white, black, race, anything of color in the original Constitution. They simply say all citizens in the United States have the right to protection of the right to vote. And that solves one of the Jim Crow laws, where they are trying to cut out former slaves from voting. For example, Alabama, Mississippi, some others passed a Jim Crow law that said you can vote, but you must take a test, a literacy test. You must prove you are intelligent, you can read and write. So when you came to register to vote, they said, read this. And if you couldn't read it, you were ineligible to vote. So Congress was responding to things like that. However, remember, half of Tennesseans who are white can't read and write. So they have a grandfather clause in Alabama and Mississippi and these states that says, if your grandfather was a voter during the election of 1860, that's when Lincoln was elected, then you are exempt from taking the literacy test. And of course, no blacks in Tennessee were eligible to vote in 1860 because the 1835 Constitution of Tennessee, it disenfranchised all of the free Negroes who had the right to vote when Tennessee became a state in 1795. They voted right up until 1835. So by 1860, none of them were voting. No blacks were voting. Certainly the slaves could not vote, and therefore they were cut out from voting. So the 15th Amendment of the National Constitution protected the right to vote. That's the one that's under debate today, because out of that amendment came the 1965 Voting Rights Act, because the 15th Amendment says Congress has the power to detail, write in the details. The 15th Amendment is only 3 or 4 paragraphs. Congress has the right to follow with legislation to affect this amendment. And of course, the most comprehensive piece of legislation was the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which 2014 is now being debated, and the Supreme Court is chipping away at that 1965 Voting Rights Act. Whereas I say the Civil War, as one great historian said in his recent book, we're still fighting the Civil War. We're still fighting the Civil War. So in 1870, the 15th Amendment protects the right to vote, and specifically it's referring to the former slaves. These are all men now, because the women do not have the right to vote yet, and they are still excluded, from the right to vote. But in 1870, Tennessee is redeemed. That is, the Democratic Party was the pro-secessionist party. The Democratic Party was the party of Andrew Jackson, born in the 1830s. The Democratic Party was the pro-slavery party. The Democratic Party is the party that will fight Lincoln tooth and nail every step of the way in the federal government through the time that he was President of the United States, and will oppose the Emancipation. But in 1870, they recaptured the state government from Warren G., from the governor and the Republicans, and Tennessee becomes all Democratic. And one of the first things the Democrats did, they revised the Constitution again. And that is the 1870 Constitution, which we now use in the state of Tennessee. It was revised. It included a poll tax. It included that anti-miscegenation law. They now put this into, not into legislative law, but into constitutional law. And the Democrats who control the state refused to ratify the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Tennessee, as I said to people in another place, don't laugh at Mississippi. Tennessee did not ratify the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States until June 1992. Until June 1992. The only thing that protected blacks the right to vote in the state of Tennessee was the national law and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. As far as Tennessee was concerned, they had no protection for the right to vote until Tennessee decided to ratify that amendment, until the 1965 right to vote. And of course, Tennessee ratified the amendment in 1990 and 1992. So Jim Crow laws were racially discriminating laws that meant to keep the whites and blacks separate, but also to keep the black Tennesseans subordinate, that they really were, according to Jim Crow laws, not full-fledged citizens. Well, the 1901 law was meant to segregate blacks and whites in higher education. Tennessee had a law, 1867, that forbid the teaching and learning of students of white and black race in the same school. So school desegregation was a state law in Tennessee in 1867. But there was no segregation of higher education. And one of the reasons there was no segregation of higher education, Tennessee had no state colleges. Northern states had them. That was Michigan, all of them had land grant institutions, which were public colleges. Tennessee was still a half century behind. She had not a single higher education institution sponsored by the state itself. So there was no public college in Tennessee. So they had never paid attention to that. And Tennessee will not have a public institution of higher education until the General Assembly adopts a private school over in East Tennessee University, which changed its name to the University of Tennessee. And in 1907, Tennessee assumes control and finance of that institution. That was the first state college for the state of Tennessee. Other than that, Tennessee had none. And then in 1909, 2 years later, the General Assembly passes a law to create 4 public teachers' colleges. Today they are East Tennessee State University, Middle Tennessee State University, University of Memphis, and one for blacks, Tennessee State University. 4 of them were created. So by 1912, Tennessee has its first 5 public institutions of higher education for its particular citizens. So after the Civil War, Maryville College, which had always admitted a few black students, Franklin college in Nashville, which went out of business right after the Civil War in 1865. They, of course, continued to admit black students to their student bodies just as they had before. But a case came before the United States Supreme Court in 1901 that had nothing to do with Tennessee. It was Kentucky. In Kentucky, Berea College had admitted blacks from the very beginning of its founding in 1855. In fact, Berea College grew to be more black students than white students by the 1880s. Anti-slavery people had established it. And its charter said it must always be a biracial institution. So segregation was forbidden in the original charter of Berea. And however, Jim Crow is spreading across the South, and Jim Crow advocates in Kentucky, they put a bill through the General Assembly of Kentucky that you cannot have blacks and whites attending the same classes. And that was called the Day Law in Kentucky. So Berea has to expel all the black students. And Berea decides, Berea College sets up a separate school over in Louisville with some money to educate those students who, Lincoln Institute is what they would call it, named after President Lincoln. They would call it Lincoln Institute over near Louisville, where the black students would be admitted and they can continue their education. Tennessee copies that. And in 1901, Tennessee has a day law that says students cannot attend class in schools in the same place of opposite races. And that includes private schools. This case, the Berea case, the Maryville College case, similar cases, go all the way to the Supreme Court because Berea College sues the state of Kentucky that this is unconstitutional. These are private institutions. These are not public institutions. These are private institutions. And the state does not have the right or the power to come in and tell a store owner or to tell a college owner they have to segregate their facility. But the United States Supreme Court in 1905 agrees. And in 1905, they agreed that a state has the right to segregate its citizens even in private institutions. And consequently, after 1905, segregation of higher education institutions in Tennessee, it is legal. It is the practice during that particular time. Now, at the same time, remember Harvard and Yale and Cornell and northern institutions are admitting black students. The northern land-grant institutions, since they were created in 1862, never excluded blacks. They segregated them on campus, but they did not exclude them from attending the institutions. Southern higher education is going to segregate them from the institution, period. And they cannot, come on campus, live off the campus, attend classes or whatever. So the Jim Crow law of 1901 was very harsh. Maryville College provides about $25,000 of its endowment money to establish a school, as Berea College did, for the blacks, and that is Swift Memorial College, which is a private institution, but also supported by the Presbyterians, just as Maryville College was established. And with the segregation of Maryville College in 1905, the precedent is set in Tennessee that there will be no colleges and universities that blacks can attend other than schools that are set up for blacks. And by that time, there are about 10 or 12 private black institutions of higher education, including Smith Memorial College, Lemoyne College in Memphis, Fisk University in Nashville, Meharry Medical College in Nashville, and several others at that time. So you can go to a black school, private, because the state of Tennessee has no public institution for whites or blacks by 1905. And, but Tennessee is giving money to George Peabody College for teachers in Nashville, appropriations, for the East Tennessee University, University of Tennessee by that time. And black legislators argue that this is discrimination that is against the Constitution of the United States. And so the General Assembly of Tennessee in the 1880s, around 1882, 83, they began to give scholarships to students who are black, who in each county, who want to go to a higher education institution. And they can take that scholarship and go to Fisk University or one of the other black schools at the time. So there is some support for black higher education, but the total number of students who were financed under that plan was about less than 20. So there's no real access to higher education for black Tennesseans, who still make up now nearly 25% of the whole state's population by that particular time. And they will make up nearly 21% of the population as late as World War I. So a fourth of the population of Tennessee are excluded from higher education financed by the public according to the Jim Crow laws of the state of Tennessee. But in 1909, the state creates 4 teacher colleges, and through some pressure, they include a black one for the blacks, and that was Tennessee Agricultural and Industrial State Normal School. These were 2-year teacher training institutions in East Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, West Tennessee for whites, and one which situated in Nashville for blacks. And so blacks get access. But that school is going to be discriminated against in terms of resources, in terms of curriculum, what it can offer and what it cannot offer in that school. So by 1941, 42, blacks sued the state of Tennessee. They sued in 1937 because they could go to Tennessee A&I State College, but they couldn't go to graduate school at University of Tennessee, the only public graduate school in the state of Tennessee, who's getting almost $1 million a year now from the state of Tennessee. They've got pharmacy, they've got engineering, they've got law, they've got medicine, they've got all these graduate and professional programs, but black Tennesseans cannot attend the University of Tennessee. So in 1937, a Tennessee A&I graduate, William B. Redmond, R-E-D-M-O-N-D, William B. Redmond sued with the help of the NAACP in the state court, and the state turned him down. Instead, what they did was they created an out-of-state scholarship program for the state of Tennessee for any black who wanted to go to University of Tennessee for any subject that was not offered at Tennessee A&I. And so in 1937, Tennessee began out-of-state fellowships where a black had to choose to go out of the state in order to attend another school anywhere. He could go to the University of Michigan, he could go to Howard University, he could go anywhere he wanted, but he couldn't go to the University of Tennessee. Those scholarships lasted until 1962. Tennessee was still passing out Jim Crow scholarships to those people. And Tennessee in 1946 47, Tennessee, under the leadership of the governor at the time, started appropriations to Meharry Medical College. Now, they would give Meharry in Nashville, the black medical college, money for students to attend who otherwise said they wanted to go to UT Medical School, because Mr. Redmond sued to go to the pharmacy school, UT, which was over in Memphis, and he was turned down. Now you can go to Meharry, and the state of Tennessee gives them a scholarship, a appropriation that they can handle those particular students. That saved Jim Crow for another, 14 years or so, until Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, decreed that separate but equal, no matter how you put it, was unconstitutional, that it was unconstitutional. Whereas the court had said in the case of Ferguson versus Plessy versus Ferguson, a case out of Louisiana, that states could separate the races, and it wasn't unconstitutional. It was not a violation of the 14th Amendment, as long as the state could prove that they treated the races equal. In other words, if you gave whites a public school, you had to give blacks a public school. If whites had a water fountain where they could stop and for the convenience of drinking water in public, you had to have one for blacks. If whites could ride on the railroad train, then you had to provide a place where blacks could ride. As long as you treated them equally, then you could discriminate, said the Supreme Court in 1896. But in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously, 9-0, says that is unconstitutional, because separate but equal is inherently unequal, because the people who are making the laws are not blacks, they are whites. They're always going to make the law in their favor. They're always going to build a better school for themselves. They're always going to have a better train car for themselves than for the blacks or others. It's just inherently unequal, and it's damaging to the child, because they did psychological studies on little 4- and 5-, 6-year-old kids, black kids, and they asked them to take tests, you know. They asked the black kids in the psychological test, which of these two pictures here is the prettiest person? They always picked out the white person. Which of these trees is the prettiest tree? Looks like a black tree. They picked out a tree with dead leaves, you know. They had been damaged by the time they were 5 years old to believe that they were inferior and that the other side was superior. That was the damaging effects of separate but equal. And as a result, in 1954, the Supreme Court says, we got to get rid of this. And there's no halfway, between it, where you can say, we're going to give them the back of the bus and whites take the front of the bus, and so on. It was damaging not only to them physically, but it was damaging to these young people mentally. Generations of black people were literally their self-confidence, their image of themselves was destroyed by Jim Crow. They still suffer that legacy of slavery and Jim Crow today, and you can look at that through the performance of black students in the classroom, of the punitive nature of trying to govern them in classroom, of the differences in the ACT and SAT score between blacks and whites, and the differences of the percentage of blacks who have college degrees today compared to the percentage of whites who have college degrees. All across the board today, Jim Crow's legacy and the legacy of slavery, as far as education is concerned, still reigns. We're still dealing with those particular legacies that affect all of us, whether they are blacks or whites or Asians or whatever, because Jim Crow is embedded in the racism of the society. And the only way you can get it out, said one civil rights leader in the 1960s in Nashville, you're going to have to wash it and wash it and wash it and wash it some more before you can cleanse the society. And that is still going on today. We're still washing and washing and washing, and it'll probably, in my opinion, be at least another 100 years before our American society is cleansed. It's been 150 years ago since slavery, as you can see. It took that long just to get beyond that particular legacy in the state of Tennessee and across the United States. And remember that Jim Crow was, finally, I'll say Jim Crow were laws. In other words, Jim Crow was what we call in Latin de jure, D-E-J-U-R-E. In other words, it was legal. Racism can also be de facto, and that is in Latin, translating from Latin to English, de facto means in fact. In other words, it's not by law, but in fact it does exist. In fact, people do practice it. So de facto segregation, it was practiced in the North. Now in the South, they are practicing de jure racial segregation. This is a law that says you got to sit on the back of the streetcar. You know, you can't sit on the front of the streetcar. Well, in the North, it was de facto. You could not, in New York City, go and stay in this hotel if you were black. You could not go in this restaurant in New York City and eat if you were black. And there were certain schools in the North, in Pennsylvania, you could not go to, and New York. So in the North, it was de facto, which the Supreme Court in '54 couldn't deal with. They can only deal with de jure legal segregation. Is unconstitutional. How do you deal with the segregation that's de facto? So since 1954, we've still been washing and washing to get rid of that. That's what the Supreme Court of 2014 is dealing with, that in fact these things still exist in voting and so on and so on. They're not law. Now Alabama doesn't have the literacy test anymore and all of that, but it has disenfranchised half of all adult Negro men in the state of Alabama, and has done that through criminal injustice laws. If you have a record, you can't vote. And there's no way for you, to redeem your right to vote in Tennessee. You can, redeem it. You can go and apply, petition, and regain your citizenship after you have been, convicted of criminals, so on and so on. If you want to, and many of them don't. So many people are still disenfranchised, which the Black Caucus is dealing with in the state of Tennessee, simply because they had a criminal record. And Tennessee has adopted the same Jim Crow laws as Alabama, as Mississippi, and so on. Or you can do it other ways. You can, move the voting places around. Tennessee does that. You can say you're not allowed to vote anymore because your registration has expired. You move to another place, You have to re-register if you move to another district, and so on and so on. I mean, there are all kinds of de facto discrimination, segregation laws. Or you have to show me that you're really you. You have to show me ID. And so that is prolific across the country because many black persons don't have a permanent ID or driver's license because they're moving around. They're the most mobile population, moving from one rental place to another rental place, and so on and so on. So we got them. They can't, they can't vote. But the Supreme Court, and they have agreed, they can't bother us because this is not legal. This is not a law. This is something we do de facto. What is important about education? Education is a liberating force. it liberates an individual who's nothing but animal species. That's all we human beings are. But education transforms us into what it is to be human. That's what education is. So all other species on this planet have same things we have. But what lifts us as human beings above other species is the form of education that we receive. And that's why we call it, in many places, liberal arts education, because it's a liberating experience. If the person is really educated, then the person is a changed person. There are many people who go to school, who go to colleges, universities, and they have diplomas and degrees. That doesn't mean that they're an educated person, because education must transform the person holistically. The whole person's got to be transformed in education. He knows and can do, in other words, what he knows is sacred knowledge. What he can do are new skills that other human beings and other species on this planet do not know and cannot do. So a person who really wants to be educated hungers for that education. That's why the slaves wanted to know how to read and write. Why is it that the master can read that piece of paper, something on that piece of paper, and he's saying something to another piece of person, and I can't do that? So slaves just hungered, to learn to read and write. How do you do that? Because the most difficult thing for a human being, in my opinion, is to take a pen or a pencil and put something on a piece of paper out of their mind, have another human being look at the piece of paper and interpret it and understand exactly what they mean, is the most difficult form of human communication. So education is a liberating force. That's why today many of conservatives and others, they're attacking the colleges, taking money from them. They are turning them into for-profit institutions to make money, not to teach people anything, but to make money and so on. Because just like the slave master, it's dangerous to have a population that is really educated. That's dangerous. If you have a population that's really educated, you advance democracy. You cannot have a democracy with an ignorant population. The more educated the population is, the more advanced democracy becomes in that particular society. It's not to the advantage of the 1% of this population, which owns 85% of the wealth in this country, to have people as smart as they are, as knowledgeable as they are, as skilled as they are, any more than the slave master wanted his slaves walking around with a college degree. He would have no slaves if all the slaves had a high school education. It was impossible. And so education is a liberating force. It's a necessity for a democratic institution or a democratic country. It must have an educated population. The cradle of democracy, the Greeks, they were not ignorant people. There was a form of education in that particular culture. And so education is also, for those who don't like it and those who want to control the others, it's a dangerous thing to have people educated. When you're educated, you're just not the same anymore. When I left Memphis, Tennessee to go to college down at Arkansas State College, 165 miles away across the river in Arkansas, I left and went away to school out of state because I realized I could never be different from the people in my neighborhood if I had the same skills and the same education as they had. And most of them had very little in my neighborhood. And when I came back, there were people saying, well, you talk different. You're acting different. You're dressed different. You don't act like us. And I said, that's because I'm educated now, you know. I went away to get better educated so that I could be different. So educated people are supposed to be different. They're supposed to speak different, write different, think different, dress different, act different. That's an educated person. We all can act in common, but that, you know, the genius of human society are its most educated persons. And if you look for revolving and evolving human society, there's nobody who has been uneducated in modern history who's led a revolution. So, you know, Mr. Castro down in Cuba had a PhD and a law degree. Lenin and, you know, all those guys that led the revolutions in Russia, they were doctorates and law degree. Mao Tse-tung's a college-educated person in China. And so we go all over the world, and it is that segment of society that helps to promote a more rapid progression of human society that bring about the changes. Yes, some people invent things, but most people who are inventors are pretty educated people. Look at all of them going back in industrial American, you know, history. They were pretty educated people. We know things that other people don't know, and if we don't know, we know how to learn, and that's what an educated person foremost is. He is a person who knows how to learn. And a good teacher is a teacher who knows how to teach his students how to learn. And once a person learns something, they can learn to do anything because they know how to study. They know how to research stuff, read stuff, and so on. That's the key, is to gain the skill of how do you learn. And so education, it's uplifting. If it had not been for those schools, the freedmen schools, 800 of them after Emancipation cropped up, to teach the former slave how to read and write. Once he can read and write, he can learn for himself. He can go get books, you know. We teach him how to learn. And that has been the most liberating force for that 4.5 million slaves, former slaves. And now today, there are 43 million descendants that live in the United States. Education has been the liberating force of that. And so it's very important in our human society. But even if you look at other species, and I was looking at a show the other day, all species have an education system, you know? They teach their young how to what? Survive, right? They teach them the necessary skills they need to get to the next generation. And that's what we do, you know? So even the other species, they can't survive without educating their young. You know, they just can't do it. It can't happen, you know. They have to teach them, even if it's a whale, you know, she's got to teach that baby whale. What are the skills that he or she needs to survive in that broad, big ocean? And so education is simply a liberating force. It is a necessary force, you know, for us species on this earth, but more so, importantly, for the human species, us. They put these guys were New Englanders, and New Englanders, remember, were foremost for starting education in the United States. They started the first college, Harvard, 1630. And in the South, it was the opposite because slaveholders didn't promote schools. First, they didn't want the slaves to read and write. They didn't want the white workers who were the managers of their plantations to be too educated. And they, of course, didn't want the white masses to have access to education. They could afford, and they did, send their children to military academies They sent them to, had private classes for them. They had tutors for them. They even sent them north to go to school. They sent them to European universities to go to school. One of the problems with the Confederacy is that you have some officers who were put into the Confederate Army in 1861 because they were volunteers, and like Nathan Bedford Forrest, they could afford to raise a regiment or a company, but they couldn't read and write. These other uppity Confederate officers with their fancy uniforms, these guys could read and write. They had been to school. Some of them had been to college, if you notice the top generals back then. They had been to the academy, to be trained as military. And that's why they treated Nathan Bedford Forrest and those guys the way they did. They gave them assignments that didn't make no sense, that kept them out there out of the way, raiding places, tearing up railroads and raiding contraband camps and stuff like that. As one new book says, if Jefferson Davis, who was just as snobbish as his set of generals, had used the Confederate cavalry effectively, he may have been able to negotiate his way out of the Civil War, because they had 100,000 cavalry men, people on horses and so on, in the Confederate force, but they never used them as an effective force. They never used them at Shiloh. They never used them at Fort Donelson. They never used them at Fredericksburg, and so on. They never used those guys. So as a result, education made a difference, because the Democrats were on this side, Republicans were on this side. They were the ones who passed the public school, they call it the Common School Law, in 1867. That was a Republican legislature that passed the Common School Law that started public schools in Tennessee in 1867. So yeah, it made a difference, between the Democrats coming to power. They intent on, even if they have to hold all Tennesseans down, not getting education, to blacks, just as they had during that time. But, now remember the parties we're talking about today are the flip-flop, Let's call the Democrats of today the Republicans of 150 years ago. And the Republicans of today are the Democrats, of Jim Crow times. They're two different profiles of those parties, today. And the Republicans today are more anti-education or anti-intellectual than the Democrats, because the Democrats today, the only way they're going to survive is by the inclusion of minorities, women, blacks, brown, yellow people, and so on, and working class people and middle class people who are trying to move up. And so they have been pretty pro-education since they flip-flopped since 1948. And so if you look at the Federal Higher Education Act, it was passed under Democrats, Lyndon Johnson, in 1965. You look at all of those, the early one in the 40s under Harry S. Truman, Democrats, So they are flip-flopped today, but they were pretty, if you had to divide them between the intellectual party and the anti-intellectual party in 1870, it would be the Democrats as the anti-intellectual party. As historian Richard Hofstadter says in his book, The History of Anti-Intellectualism in America, not just Tennessee, but in many places across the state, there's a grain of intellectualism where people don't want to be intellectualized, and the wealthy certainly don't want the general population to be intellectualized. Because if you intellectualize, then you value learning. You hunger for learning. You'll get smarter than the boss, and the boss don't want you getting smarter. Instead of him owning 80% of all the wealth, you'll own 80% of all the wealth. It'll be the other way around. And slavery, slave owners only made up 15% of the families in the state of Tennessee owned slaves. 85% of the people in Tennessee did not and could not afford to own a single slave. But that 15% of the families in the book I'm writing now, I call them the slaveocracy, the slaveholding class. That 15% of Tennessee own 57% of the best land in the state of Tennessee. That family. And if we overlaid that up today, 2014, say what percentage of the families in Tennessee own the construction companies, especially highway construction companies, only about 5-6%. If we overlaid antebellum times with 21st century Tennessee, it would look about the same. It would look about the same in terms of the apportionment of wealth, because it's still malapportioned between those who have, and most of us are have-nots. Although we think we got a lot, we got a car, we got a house, and so on and so on. But our country is still, since 1607, filthy rich. The resources of this country are unbelievable. Everybody outside understands that, but us. It is unbelievable. But the way that we divide it up then and now is kind of shameful, you know. And history proves that. So, you know, it's a very complex story, you know, when you get into talking about education and economics and so on, because that's the key, you know. I mean, studies show the higher the education, the more the income. The Republicans were more pro-education than the Democratic Party. Now, the Democratic Party, again, keep in mind, the Democratic Party is born as a result of Andrew Jackson becoming president in 1828. And the Democratic Party is the party of the masses, you know. All these people are being left out of the prosperity of the country, the common man, as Jacksonians call it. They want to be included. We want land, we want wealth, we want slaves, you know. We want the same thing, you know, that the wealthy people, and so the Democratic Party became a very powerful party, but necessarily also a pro-slavery party and anti-education. You know, people thought and still think, you know, these boneheads are educated, they ain't good for nothing. You know, the education ain't good for nothing. We need to put them out there and let them grow some crops, you know, and pick some cotton or something. But education ruins a man. That's what, you know, many people said back in that day and time, that education really was a ruination of many people. So the Republicans, what do they do in 1862 when the Democrats are out of power and the Confederates are in control of the southern states? One of the most important acts they passed that still affects us today was the 1862 Morrill Land Grant Act. And that act set aside land, public land, federal land, that would be turned over to the states, and the states can sell that land to set up their first public college. That's why there's a University of Michigan. That's why there's the Ohio State. That's why there is University of Kansas. Every state has a land grant institution today. Auburn is the land grant in Alabama. Auburn University is a land grant. University of Mississippi is the land grant. And in the southern states, because of segregation, beginning in 1891, they put an amendment on the Morrill Land Grant Act. You cannot cut out people from those land grant institutions. You either must let them come to, you know, Michigan State or Illinois State, or you can create a separate institution for them. And all of the southern states, they created separate institutions. So there you find two land grant colleges, Auburn University, Alabama State University, the black one. In Tennessee is University of Tennessee. Tennessee A&I is a black land grant. Mississippi, University of Mississippi, Jackson State University is the black land. Go through every one of them, and every southern state has a land grant institute, has two land grant institutions. But that was because of the Republicans, and why? The Republican Party when it was formed in 1854 out of anger against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which said you can now bring slaves into Nebraska or Kansas or any new territory as long as the people in that area, popular sovereignty, voted in their state constitution to allow slavery. They're angry. So all these guys come together and form a new party, the Republican Party in 1854. Lincoln is so angry, he comes back into politics in Illinois, where he was so disgusted with Congress as a congressman, he left politics, went back into law, but they passed this God-forbidden Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Free Soil Party, they joined the Republican Party. And the Free Soilers mostly are New Englanders. They don't want any slave masters coming into the new territory because they think they are retrogressive. They kept them out of Ohio, the Northwest Territory. They didn't want Southerners moving into Illinois. They didn't want them moving into Wisconsin or Michigan because they thought they were educationally retrogressive. When they passed the Northwest Ordinance,